leaders gathered here at the Detroit Policy Conference are discussing how to make the city a better place to live, work, and play. A new report from Detroit Future City suggests a major strategy for moving the city forward involves growing the African American middle class. Here to talk more about the report and its recommendations is the Executive Director of Detroit Future City, Anika Goss. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Yeah. So I'm going to start here. You and I grew up in the city at about the same time in families that were firmly implanted in the black middle class that grew out of labor movement and all the other things that developed in this city.
That's right.
How did we get from that in our childhood to a place where most African Americans in the city could not imagine calling themselves middle class?
Right. I really think what happened is, well, what we've seen from the data is just after that, in the early 2000s, African American middle class households started to move to the suburbs.
Yes.
Some of that had to do with jobs, right? Like their jobs were already further and further out, but a lot of it had to do with the stability of the city itself, right? It was a time of transition. It was a really hard time for Detroit. And so you had to make hard choices about where to raise your family and where to invest.
Yeah. So in the report, it makes clear there's sort of two ends to this problem. One you just mentioned, which is that African American families no longer see much benefit to living in the city.
Right.
But it's also that the people who are left behind don't have that ladder from the poverty they live in.
That's
the
right.
economic opportunity, and I feel like that may be growing faster than people think it is.
Exactly, because when we began to lose the base, right, that African American middle class base, or the middle class base in general, then the people who are left are people who really couldn't afford to really maintain a lot of those neighborhoods, right, or a lot of the rest of the city. And so you are stuck with, or the people who were living there were really sort of entrenched in neighborhoods that were concentrated in poverty, that weren't really well served. And one of the interesting things that we found was that Detroiters, African Americans in Detroit, were 75% more likely to live in a neighborhood that did not have middle class, as opposed to their middle class white counterparts in the suburbs, that were exactly the opposite. Like 80% of middle class white households live in white middle class neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And middle class African Americans, especially in Detroit, just don't.
They don't.
And a lot of it is because there were so few neighborhoods.
Yeah. The racial dynamic here is driven by the fact that, in part at least, the city is just overwhelmingly African American.
Right.
There's almost not much point in talking about it in terms that try to cloak that.
Right.
But I also wonder if there are instructive things we ought to be concerned with regard to race and how race aggravates that situation.
Well, what we've seen is that there are stark inequities with things like job placement and wage and workforce outcomes and educational attainment. And those inequities have been directly attributed to race. And that's really when that becomes part of the problem. And I think why it was so important for us to be able to focus on it this way is that if we're already seeing some of these inequities in a city that's majority African American, then once the city begins to grow and thrive and there's more opportunities, that means the people who are already here won't have the opportunity to take advantage of it, right?
Yeah, right.
And what we know about racial equity in general is that unless there is intentionality to be inclusive and to make sure that everyone can benefit, it just will not happen.
Yeah.
And so it was really important that people understand that this is like a really basic, data-driven, evidence-based issue that we really want people to see this as an opportunity for Detroit. Detroit can lead the country in inclusive growth.
Yeah. Let's talk about solutions.
Yeah.
How do we get back even to the time when you and I were growing up in Detroit, when the black middle class was a huge part of the local economy and culture and all of that?
I think we can get there.
Yeah.
I think, well, for one, that middle class income bracket isn't this, just as it was when we were growing up. There's a lot of people in that bracket, right? So everybody from teachers to doctors can fall into that middle class income bracket.
That was kind of the magic of Detroit.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And so the infrastructure of Detroit to be able to accommodate a variety of income levels is still there. So it's not like we have to rebuild a whole new city for a diversity in income levels. We can actually grow and increase income household wealth now. We can increase the middle class and by attracting middle class families here now. So by looking at Detroit, we really believe there's about at least 3 different things that we need to focus on, really specifically. One is education attainment and wage. That making sure that our education attainment is higher. It's only 14% of Detroiters have a bachelor's degree or higher. That's something that we have to be able to do something about. It's got to be way higher. And 2, with education attainment, so even with the bachelor's degree, we need to be making more money.
African Americans make less.
Detroiters make less. Detroiters make significant, like 20,000 less than their suburban counterparts with the bachelor's degree. And so some of that is economic competitiveness, right? If we were attracting doctors, teachers, police officers in a really targeted and incentive-based way, we would be able to increase those wages much higher because it would be a much more competitive market for those kinds of careers, right? And we need to be really, really strategic about how to grow the income of the lower middle class that we have right now.
The people who live in...
That's exactly right.
And not anywhere near middle class. I mean, these are people, in some cases, living in poverty.
That's right. People who are living... We have to be able to create real pathways for growth. So whether that's job training, whether that's connecting community college to actual skills that are linking to jobs, whether it's looking at the healthcare industry, but really looking at industries that have a pipeline of jobs where people can actually move up, and how we actually get people into those positions. That needs to be a strategy, but it has to be a strategy that crosses sectors. So education can't be in a silo by itself, right? And automotive industry can't be in a silo by itself. We have to be able to cross these sectors so that we can actually create workforce outcomes for Detroiters.
Okay, a lot of work to do.
A lot, yeah.
Thanks very much for being here, and congratulations on the report.
Oh, thank you for having me.